The summer heat was unbearable in London that Tuesday afternoon. Tourists crowded around Buckingham Palace, their cameras clicking constantly as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the famous red-coated guards standing motionless at their posts. Among the sea of visitors was Marcus Thompson, a 32-year-old construction worker from Ohio, who had saved for 3 years to bring his family to England. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he watched his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, run around excitedly, her blonde pigtails bouncing with each step. His wife, Sarah, was busy taking photos of everything, determined to document every moment of their dream vacation. This trip meant everything to them. After years of working double shifts and cutting expenses, they had finally made it to London. The guard standing nearest to them was a tall, imposing figure named James Harrison. At 26 years old, James had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 4 years. His red tunic was perfectly pressed. His black bearskin hat stood tall and proud, and his polished boots reflected the afternoon sun. To the tourists, he was just another statue-like figure, a living piece of British tradition. But beneath that stoic exterior, James was fighting his own private battle. 3 weeks earlier, James had received the worst news of his life. His younger brother David, who had been deployed with the British Army in Afghanistan, had been killed in an improvised explosive device attack. David was only 23, fresh out of military training, full of life and dreams. He had planned to propose to his girlfriend when he returned home. James had been the one to encourage David to join the military, telling him it would make him stronger and give him purpose. The guilt was eating James alive. Every day he stood at his post, he thought about David. Every tourist who laughed and joked around him felt like a mockery of his pain. The tradition of remaining perfectly still and emotionless during duty, which had once filled him with pride, now felt like a prison. He couldn't grieve properly, couldn't break down, couldn't even show a flicker of the devastation he felt inside. Marcus noticed his daughter was getting cranky from the heat. Emma's cheeks were flushed red, and she was complaining that she was thirsty. Sarah suggested they find some shade, but Emma insisted she wanted to see the guard up close first. She had been fascinated by the guards since they arrived, asking endless questions about why they didn't move and whether they were real people. As they approached James's position, Marcus pulled out a water bottle from his backpack. The plastic bottle was covered in condensation, droplets of cool water clinging to its surface. Emma reached for it eagerly, but in her excitement and the crowd's pushing, she accidentally knocked it from her father's hands. The bottle flew through the air in what seemed like slow motion. Marcus lunged forward, trying to catch it, but his movement only made things worse. The bottle hit the ground near James's feet and exploded upward, sending a spray of cold water directly onto the guard's pristine red uniform and into his face. The crowd fell silent instantly. Dozens of tourists turned to stare, their phones and cameras now pointed at the scene unfolding before them. Some gasped audibly. Others began whispering urgently to their companions. Everyone knew that the Queen's Guards were famous for never breaking character, no matter what happened around them. Marcus felt his stomach drop. His face turned pale as he realized what had just happened. Stories flashed through his mind of tourists being arrested or fined for interfering with the guards. He had read about people being escorted away by police for much less serious incidents. His dream vacation was about to turn into a nightmare. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," Marcus stammered, his voice barely audible. "It was an accident. My daughter, she's just tired from the heat. And His words trailed off as he looked at the water dripping from James's uniform and face. Sarah quickly pulled Emma closer, her maternal instincts kicking in as she tried to shield her daughter from whatever was about to happen. Emma looked confused and scared, not fully understanding why everyone had gone quiet and why her daddy looked so worried. James stood perfectly still, water still dripping from his chin and uniform. His training had taught him to remain motionless regardless of weather, distractions, or even physical contact from tourists. He had endured rain, snow, extreme heat, and countless attempts by visitors to make him react. Nothing was supposed to break his composure, but something was different this time. As the cold water hit his face, it felt like a shock to his system. For a brief moment, the overwhelming grief he had been suppressing threatened to break through his carefully maintained facade. The contrast between the cool water and his burning emotional pain created a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. The tourists continued to stare, some beginning to film with their phones, expecting to capture the moment when the tourist family would be led away by security. Others whispered about how much trouble the American family was probably in. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus looked around desperately, hoping to see security or police who might help resolve the situation quickly. He was prepared to accept whatever consequences came his way, but he was terrified about how this might affect his wife and daughter. This was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, not a disaster that would traumatize his family. James could feel every eye on him. His commanding officers had drilled into him the importance of maintaining the dignity and tradition of the Queen's Guard. Any break in protocol would reflect not just on him, but on the entire institution. Yet as he stood there, water dripping from his face, he found himself thinking not about protocol or tradition, but about his brother David, about loss, about human connection, and about the frightened little girl whose innocent mistake had created this moment. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Everyone waited to see what would happen next, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would change not just James's life, but touch the hearts of millions around the world. James felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him as water continued to drip from his ceremonial uniform. The silence that had fallen over the crowd was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of London traffic and the nervous shuffling of feet on the pavement. His military training screamed at him to remain motionless, to uphold the centuries-old tradition of the Queen's Guard. But something deeper was stirring within him. As he looked down at the frightened little girl clinging to her mother's leg, James saw something that pierced through his grief-hardened heart. Emma's wide blue eyes were filled with tears, not from any injury but from the fear that she had done something terribly wrong. Her small hands were pressed against her mouth, and she kept looking between her father and the guard, sensing the tension even if she didn't fully understand it. In that moment, James didn't see a tourist who had broken protocol. He saw his brother David at the same age, scared and looking for comfort after accidentally breaking their mother's favorite vase. He remembered how David used to hide behind him whenever their father raised his voice, how he would seek James's protection and reassurance that everything would be okay. The memories hit James like a physical blow. David laughing at his terrible jokes, David calling him every week from Afghanistan just to hear a familiar voice, David's excitement about proposing to his girlfriend Lucy when he returned home. All of those moments, all of those plans, all of that life cut short by a roadside bomb thousands of miles away. Marcus stood frozen, his face a mask of worry and regret. He had worked construction his entire adult life, dealing with difficult situations and problem-solving under pressure, but this was completely outside his experience. He had no idea what the protocol was for accidentally soaking a royal guard, and every second that ticked by made him more anxious about the consequences. Sarah was doing her best to comfort Emma while keeping a watchful eye on the situation. As a kindergarten teacher, she was used to managing children in stressful situations, but this was unlike anything she had ever encountered. She could see the other tourists pointing and whispering, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed amusement at the American family's predicament. The crowd began to grow larger as word spread about the incident. More tourists abandoned their own sightseeing to come and watch what they assumed would be either an arrest or at least a stern confrontation with security. Some were already posting on social media about the drama unfolding at Buckingham Palace. Among the onlookers was Margaret Chen, a retired nurse from Singapore who was visiting London with her daughter's family. Margaret had worked in emergency rooms for 40 years and had developed an eye for reading people's emotional states. As she watched the young guard standing motionless with water dripping from his face, she noticed something others missed. There was pain in his eyes, a deep sadness that went far beyond this minor incident with the tourists. James felt his carefully constructed emotional barriers beginning to crumble. The water on his face reminded him of the tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed since receiving news of David's death. Military training had taught him to compartmentalize his emotions, to push through pain and maintain focus on duty. But standing there looking at this frightened child who reminded him so much of his lost brother, those techniques were failing him. The Queen's Guard protocol was clear and unwavering. Remain at attention. Do not speak to tourists. Do not react to any provocation or disturbance. Maintain the dignity of the position at all times. James had followed these rules perfectly for 4 years. Through rainstorms that soaked him to the bone, through summer heat that made him dizzy, through countless attempts by tourists to make him smile or move. But grief had a way of changing a person's perspective on what truly mattered. As James stood there, he found himself questioning whether maintaining rigid protocol was more important than showing compassion to a scared little girl and her worried father. His brother David had always been the more emotional of the two, quick to offer comfort to anyone in need, never hesitating to break rules if it meant helping someone. Emma finally found her voice, her words coming out in a trembling whisper that somehow carried across the silent crowd. "I'm sorry, Mr. Soldier, I didn't mean to make you wet. Please don't be mad at my daddy." Her innocent plea cut through the tension like a knife, and several people in the crowd felt their own eyes beginning to water. Marcus knelt down beside his daughter, his voice gentle but firm. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll make this right somehow." But even as he spoke the words, he had no idea how they could possibly fix this situation. He looked up at the guard's face, searching for any sign of humanity behind the ceremonial facade. That's when James made a decision that would change everything. Against every rule he had been taught, against every instinct his military training had instilled in him, he slowly began to move. It started with just a slight relaxation of his rigid posture, so subtle that most of the crowd didn't notice at first. Margaret Chen, however, caught the movement immediately. Having spent decades reading body language in high-stress medical situations, she recognized the moment when someone made a choice to prioritize human connection over institutional protocol. She found herself holding her breath, wondering what this young guard was about to do. James could feel his commanding officer's voice echoing in his head, reminding him of the consequences for breaking character while on duty. Court-martial, demotion, possible dismissal from service. All of these potential punishments flashed through his mind. But stronger than his fear of professional consequences was his memory of David's voice telling him that sometimes being a good person was more important than being a good soldier. The water had stopped dripping from his face, but the emotional floodgates that had been triggered by this simple accident were just beginning to open. James knew that whatever he did next would either be the biggest mistake of his military career or the most important moment of his life as a human being. As the crowd continued to watch in stunned silence, James made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he began to break the most fundamental rule of the Queen's Guard, setting in motion a chain of events that would touch hearts around the world and remind everyone watching that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is choose compassion over convention. The moment James began to move, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Cell phones were raised higher, camera flashes began clicking rapidly, and the whispered conversations grew louder. No one could believe what they were witnessing. A Queen's Guard was actually breaking protocol right before their eyes. James slowly reached up and removed his towering bearskin hat, revealing damp brown hair that stuck to his forehead. The formal military bearing that had defined his posture for 4 years began to dissolve as he looked directly at little Emma, who was still clinging to her mother's leg with tears streaming down her face. What happened next shocked everyone present. James knelt down to Emma's eye level, his red ceremonial tunic creating a bright splash of color against the gray pavement. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and warm, completely different from the stern military bearing everyone expected from a royal guard. "Hey there, little one," James said softly, his British accent carrying a kindness that seemed to wrap around Emma like a warm hug. "Please don't cry. You haven't done anything wrong at all. Sometimes accidents happen, and that's perfectly okay." Emma stopped crying almost immediately, her wide blue eyes staring at this soldier who had suddenly become a real person instead of a statue. She had never heard such a gentle voice from someone who looked so important and official. Her small hand slowly moved away from her mouth as she processed this unexpected turn of events. Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief. Instead of the arrest or confrontation he had been dreading, this guard was showing kindness to his daughter. He struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude and amazement at what was happening. "Sir, we're so sorry," Marcus managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "We never meant for this to happen. Is there anything we can do? Any way to make this right?" James turned his attention to Marcus, and for the first time since David's death, he felt a genuine smile beginning to form on his face. "You don't need to apologize for anything. Your daughter was just being a kid on a hot day. That's exactly what kids should be doing." The crowd around them had grown to nearly 100 people, all straining to hear this unprecedented conversation. Margaret Chen moved closer, her nurse's instincts telling her that this young man was dealing with something much deeper than a simple uniform mishap. She could see pain in his eyes despite his gentle demeanor with the child. Sarah finally found her voice, her teacher's instincts kicking in as she watched her daughter's fear transform into fascination. "Emma, can you say thank you to the nice guard for being so understanding?" Emma took a tentative step forward, her natural childhood curiosity overcoming her earlier fear. "Thank you, Mr. Guard. Are you really real? My friend Tyler said guards are just robots that look like people." James couldn't help but laugh, the sound surprising him as much as everyone else. It was the first time he had genuinely laughed since receiving news of David's death. "I'm very real, I promise. My name is James. What's your name?" "I'm Emma Thompson, and I'm 8 years old," she replied with the straightforward honesty that only children possess. "Are you hot in that big red coat? It's really pretty, but it looks super warm." "It is quite warm," James admitted, looking down at his ceremonial uniform. "But it's part of my job to wear it and stand very still to guard this important place. Although," he added with a conspiratorial whisper, "between you and me, that cold water actually felt rather nice on such a hot day." The crowd began to murmur with approval and amazement. Many were pulling out their phones not to mock or exploit the situation, but to capture what they recognized as a genuinely beautiful moment of human connection. This wasn't the sterile, distant interaction they expected from royal protocol. This was real, warm, and incredibly touching. Margaret Chen stepped forward slightly, her experienced eye still picking up on the underlying sadness in James's demeanor. Despite his kindness with the child, she could see that this young man was carrying a heavy burden. As a healthcare professional, she had learned to recognize the signs of grief, and something told her this guard's compassion came from a place of recent loss. Emma, emboldened by James's friendliness, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Why did you start talking to us?" "My daddy read that guards aren't supposed to move or talk to people." James paused for a moment, considering how to answer such an innocent question. The truth was complex. His grief over David, his questioning of rigid protocols, his recognition of his own humanity in this family's fear and embarrassment. But Emma needed a simpler explanation. "Sometimes," James said carefully, "being kind to people is more important than following every single rule. You were scared and your parents were worried, and that seemed like a good reason to remember that I'm a person first and a guard second." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to this remarkable young man speak to his daughter. In his blue-collar world back in Ohio, he had encountered his share of authority figures who prioritized rules over people. To witness such genuine human decency from someone in such a formal, traditional role was overwhelming. "You have a beautiful family," James said to Marcus and Sarah. "You should be proud of how polite and sweet your daughter is. She handled this whole situation better than most adults would have." Sarah smiled through her own tears. "Thank you for saying that. And thank you for being so incredibly kind. This trip means the world to us. We saved for years to bring Emma here, and you've just made it even more special than we ever imagined." As James listened to Sarah talk about their family's sacrifice to make this trip happen, he thought about David's dreams and plans that would never come to fruition. Here was a family creating precious memories together, something his brother would never have the chance to do. Instead of feeling bitter about the unfairness of it all, James found himself feeling grateful to be part of their special moment. The crowd around them had become completely silent, everyone recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a guard breaking protocol. This was a demonstration of human dignity, compassion, and the power of choosing kindness over convention. James knew that his superiors would hear about this incident within hours. Security cameras were recording everything. Tourists were filming, and word would spread quickly through official channels. His military career might very well be over. But as he looked at Emma's bright smile and her parents' grateful faces, he realized he had never felt more certain about any decision in his life. As James continued to kneel beside Emma, chatting with her about her trip to London and her favorite things about England, Margaret Chen made a decision that would prove crucial to what happened next. The retired nurse had spent her career advocating for patients and had developed a strong sense of when someone needed support, even if they didn't ask for it directly. Margaret approached the small group with the confident stride of someone accustomed to taking charge in difficult situations. "Excuse me," she said politely to Marcus and Sarah. "I couldn't help but notice this lovely interaction. I'm Margaret Chen, and I was wondering if I might have a word with this young gentleman when he has a moment." James looked up at Margaret with curiosity. Her warm smile and kind eyes reminded him of his grandmother, and there was something about her presence that felt safe and comforting. "Of course, ma'am. Is everything all right?" Margaret knelt down beside James, lowering her voice so that only he could hear while Emma continued chatting excitedly with her parents about meeting a real guard. "I spent 40 years as a nurse, dear, and I've learned to recognize when someone is carrying more than their share of pain. I can see it in your eyes, even when you're being wonderfully kind to this sweet family." James felt his breath catch in his throat. He had become so skilled at hiding his grief behind his military facade that he had almost convinced himself others couldn't see through it. But this stranger had seen right to the heart of his pain within minutes of watching him interact with Emma. "I don't know what you're going through," Margaret continued gently, "but I want you to know that what you just did here, choosing compassion over protocol, that takes tremendous courage and character. Whatever burden you're carrying, you should know that you're a remarkable young man." For the first time since David's death, James felt truly seen by another person. Not as a guard, not as a soldier, but as a human being in pain who was trying to do the right thing despite his own struggles. His eyes began to well up with tears he had been holding back for weeks. Emma noticed James's change in expression, and with the intuitive empathy that children often possess, she reached out and gently touched his hand. "Are you sad, James? My mommy says it's okay to be sad sometimes. When I'm sad, hugs help a lot." Without waiting for permission, Emma wrapped her small arms around James's neck in a spontaneous hug. The simple, innocent gesture broke through the last of James's emotional defenses. This child, who had been terrified of getting him in trouble just minutes before, was now offering him comfort in his moment of vulnerability. James hugged Emma back gently, feeling tears roll down his cheeks as 3 weeks of suppressed grief finally found its release. The crowd around them fell completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something deeply personal and profound. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances, both recognizing that their daughter had somehow intuited that this kind guard needed comfort. Sarah's teacher instincts told her that Emma had picked up on emotions that the adults around her were too polite or too distant to acknowledge. "My brother David would have loved meeting you," James whispered to Emma, his voice barely audible. "He was only a little older than you when he decided he wanted to be a soldier too. He was very brave, just like you are." Emma pulled back from the hug and looked at James with serious 8-year-old eyes. "Where is your brother now? Is he a guard like you?" James took a shaky breath, wondering how to explain death and loss to a child in the middle of a crowded tourist area. But Emma's innocent question deserved an honest answer. "He was a soldier, but he had to go to heaven a few weeks ago. That's why I was feeling sad." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children often show toward difficult truths. "My grandpa went to heaven last year. Mommy said he watches over us now and that he's not sick anymore. Maybe your brother is watching over you too." The simplicity and wisdom of Emma's words hit James like a physical blow. Here was a child offering him the same comfort he had been trying to give her just moments earlier. The circular nature of compassion, the way kindness seemed to multiply and return when it was needed most, overwhelmed him with a sense of connection he hadn't felt since David's death. Margaret Chen watched this exchange with tears in her own eyes, recognizing the healing power of unexpected human connection. She had seen it countless times in hospital settings, how strangers could provide comfort and insight that family and friends sometimes couldn't offer. The crowd around them had grown to over 200 people, but the atmosphere had shifted completely from curiosity and entertainment to something approaching reverence. People were wiping their own eyes, taking photos not to mock or sensationalize, but to preserve a moment of genuine human beauty. Marcus finally found his voice again. "Sir, James, I don't know what loss you're dealing with, but I want you to know that what you've shown my family today, the kindness and grace you've demonstrated, that's something we'll remember for the rest of our lives. You've made this trip unforgettable for all the right reasons." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Emma talks about wanting to help people when she grows up. Seeing how you chose to be kind even when you were hurting yourself, that's exactly the kind of lesson we hope she learns." James stood up slowly, Emma's small hand still holding his. He looked around at the crowd that had gathered, at the phones recording every moment, at the security cameras that he knew were capturing everything. His career as a Queen's Guard was almost certainly over, but he felt lighter than he had in weeks. "Thank you," he said to the Thompson family, his voice steady despite his tears. "You've given me something precious today, too. You've reminded me that my brother's memory is honored not by following rules perfectly, but by choosing to be the kind of person he would be proud to call his brother." Emma squeezed his hand tighter. "Can we be friends, James? When I go home to America, can I send you letters about school and stuff?" James looked down at this remarkable little girl who had somehow managed to help him begin healing from his grief while he was supposed to be helping her feel better about a simple accident. "I would love that very much, Emma. I think writing letters to a friend in America sounds like exactly what I need." As the crowd began to applaud spontaneously, James realized that his decision to break protocol had led to something much more important than he had initially understood. This wasn't just about showing kindness to a tourist family. It was about remembering his own humanity and finding a way to honor his brother's memory through compassion rather than rigid adherence to rules. Within an hour of the incident, videos of James's interaction with the Thompson family had begun spreading across social media platforms around the world. Margaret Chen had discreetly recorded the final moments of their conversation and posted it to her daughter's Facebook account with a simple caption: "Sometimes the most beautiful thing about tradition is knowing when to break it for something more important." The video went viral with stunning speed. By evening, it had been shared over 50,000 times, with comments pouring in from people across the globe who were moved by the display of human compassion they had witnessed. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly James Harrison, the Queen's Guard who chose kindness over protocol, became an international sensation. But James was unaware of the growing media attention as he completed his shift that afternoon. After the Thompson family had departed with promises to stay in touch, he had returned to his post for the remaining 2 hours of his duty. The other tourists who approached him seemed different somehow, more respectful, more aware that beneath the ceremonial uniform was a real person with real feelings. When James finally returned to the barracks that evening, he was met by his commanding officer, Major Patricia Whitman, a stern woman in her 50s who had spent 25 years in military service. James had expected this conversation, and he had prepared himself for whatever consequences awaited him. "Guardsman Harrison," Major Whitman said as James stood at attention in her office, "I trust you're aware that your conduct today was highly irregular and completely contrary to established protocol." "Yes, ma'am," James replied, his voice steady. "I take full responsibility for my actions, and I'm prepared to accept whatever disciplinary measures you deem appropriate." Major Whitman studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Before we discuss consequences, I think you should know that I've spent the last 3 hours fielding phone calls from journalists, television producers, and government officials. Your interaction with that American family has captured global attention." James felt his stomach drop. The last thing he had wanted was to bring negative publicity to the Queen's Guard, or embarrass the institution he had served with pride for 4 years. "Ma'am, I deeply regret any embarrassment this may have caused to the Guard or to Her Majesty's service." "Embarrassment?" Major Whitman's eyebrows rose. "Harrison, do you have any idea what people are saying about what you did today?" She turned her computer monitor toward him, showing a flood of social media posts, news articles, and comments from around the world. The headlines read, "Queen's Guard shows true British values," "Compassion over protocol," "A lesson in humanity," and "The Royal Guard who reminded us what service really means." James stared at the screen in disbelief as Major Whitman continued. The palace has received over 3,000 messages today, all praising your conduct and expressing admiration for your character. The Prime Minister's office called to commend your demonstration of British values. The American ambassador personally thanked me for the kindness shown to American tourists. I don't understand, ma'am, James said quietly. I broke protocol. I violated direct orders about maintaining ceremonial discipline. Major Whitman leaned back in her chair, her stern expression softening slightly. Harrison, in my 25 years of service, I've learned that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. What you did today served the highest purpose of military service, protecting and comforting civilians in distress. That little girl was terrified, her family was mortified, and you chose to prioritize their well-being over rigid adherence to ceremony. She clicked on one of the video clips, showing the moment when Emma hugged James and he began to cry. This, Harrison, is what real strength looks like. It takes no courage to stand motionless for hours. It takes tremendous courage to show vulnerability and compassion when the world is watching. James felt overwhelmed by this unexpected response. He had been prepared for court-martial, dismissal, or at minimum a severe reprimand. Instead, he was being praised for the very actions he thought would end his career. Ma'am, if I may ask, what happens now? Am I being transferred or disciplined in any way? Major Whitman smiled for the first time since James had known her. On the contrary, Harrison. The Colonel wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. There's talk of using your actions today as a case study in the military academy. Curriculum, an example of how good judgment sometimes requires making difficult choices about when rules should be flexible. She paused, her expression becoming more personal. I also understand that you recently lost your brother in Afghanistan. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry that our rigid structure didn't provide you with adequate support during your grief. Perhaps this incident will help us examine how we can better care for our personnel during difficult times. James felt tears welling up again at this unexpected compassion from his superior officer. Thank you, ma'am. David always said that being a good soldier meant being a good person first. I think he would have approved of what I did today. I have no doubt he would have been proud, Major Whitman replied. Now I need to inform you that you'll likely face significant media attention in the coming days. The Palace Press Office has prepared some guidelines for you, should you choose to speak with journalists. The choice is entirely yours. You're under no obligation to participate in any interviews or public appearances. As James left the Major's office, his head was spinning from this unexpected turn of events. He had gone from expecting the end of his career to being told he might become a poster child for compassionate military service. The irony wasn't lost on him that his worst professional mistake had apparently become his greatest achievement. Back in his quarters, James called his parents to tell them about the day's events. His mother cried when he described meeting Emma, and how the little girl's hug had helped him finally grieve for David properly. His father, a veteran himself, told James that he understood exactly why he had made the choice he did. Your brother would be laughing his head off right now, his father said. He always said you were too serious about following rules. I think he'd love knowing that you finally learned when to break them for something more important. That night, as James tried to process everything that had happened, he received an email that made him smile through his tears. It was from Sarah Thompson, who had managed to get his contact information through the Palace Press Office. Attached was a photo of Emma in her pajamas, holding a drawing she had made of James in his red uniform, with a big smile on his face and a rainbow overhead. The email read, Dear James, Emma wanted you to know that she told everyone at the hotel about her new friend, the brave guard who helped her not be scared. She asked me to tell you that she hopes you're not sad anymore, and that she can't wait to write you letters from America. Thank you for showing our daughter that real heroes are the people who choose to be kind. Love, the Thompson family. James realized that in trying to comfort a frightened child, he had found his own path toward healing. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters could change everything, and sometimes breaking the rules was exactly what the situation required. 6 months later, James Harrison stood in the same spot outside Buckingham Palace where his life had changed forever. But now, instead of the rigid isolation he had once maintained, he found himself genuinely connecting with the tourists who approached him during designated interaction periods, a new initiative that had been implemented partly because of the global response to his actions that summer day. The Queen's Guard protocols had been quietly revised to allow for limited, appropriate interactions with visitors during specific times, acknowledging that human connection could enhance rather than diminish the dignity of the institution. James had become something of a celebrity within the military, frequently invited to speak at training academies about the balance between tradition and compassion. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. James had appeared on television programs across Britain and America, sharing his story about grief, duty, and the moment when a child's innocent accident had taught him that humanity was more important than rigid protocol. The palace had been flooded with letters from families around the world, sharing their own stories of loss and how James's actions had inspired them. Most remarkably, the incident had sparked a global conversation about the nature of service and the importance of emotional intelligence in all professions. Military academies, police departments, and even corporate training programs began using the video of James and Emma as an example of how showing vulnerability and compassion could actually strengthen rather than weaken authority. James had used his newfound platform to establish the David Harrison Foundation, named after his brother, which provided support for military families dealing with grief and loss. The foundation had raised over £200,000 in its first 6 months, funding counseling services and family support programs that James wished had been available during his own darkest period. Emma Thompson had kept her promise about writing letters. Every few weeks, James would receive a carefully written note from Ohio, decorated with colorful drawings and filled with updates about school, friends, and her growing interest in helping people. Emma had told her classmates about her friend in England, and several other children had begun writing to James as well, creating an unexpected pen pal program that brought joy to his daily routine. The Thompson family had returned to London for Christmas, making James their first stop upon arrival. Emma had grown taller and more confident, but she still gave him the same enthusiastic hugs that had first broken through his grief 6 months earlier. Marcus and Sarah had brought photos of Emma's school presentation about her trip to England, where she had shared the story of the kind guard who taught her that adults could change their minds about rules when kindness was more important. On this particular February afternoon, as James stood at his post during a designated interaction period, he noticed a young mother struggling with a crying toddler near the palace gates. The woman looked exhausted and stressed, clearly overwhelmed by trying to manage sightseeing with a cranky child. Without hesitation, James walked over to them. "Hello there," he said gently to the little boy, who was about 2 years old and red-faced from crying. "I'm James. Are you having a rough day?" The toddler stopped crying immediately, fascinated by James's colorful uniform and kind voice. The mother looked up with surprise and gratitude, clearly not expecting a royal guard to approach them with help rather than annoyance at the disturbance. "I'm so sorry," the woman said quickly. "He's just tired and hungry, and I know we're being disruptive." "Please don't apologize," James interrupted with a warm smile. "Would it help if I distracted him while you take a moment to collect yourself? I've learned that sometimes the best part of this job is helping families enjoy their visit to London." As James engaged the toddler with gentle conversation and silly faces, drawing delighted giggles from the little boy, the mother felt tears of relief in her eyes. She was traveling alone with her son after a difficult divorce, and this trip to London was supposed to be a fresh start for both of them. This unexpected kindness from a stranger felt like a sign that things might indeed get better. Margaret Chen, who happened to be visiting London again with her family, witnessed this new interaction from across the courtyard. She smiled to herself, recognizing the same compassionate spirit she had seen in James 6 months earlier. The retired nurse had followed James's story in the media and had been delighted to see how his moment of vulnerability had blossomed into a mission of service to others. Margaret approached after James had successfully calmed the toddler and helped the young mother feel more at ease. "James," she said warmly, "I don't know if you remember me, but I was here the day you met Emma Thompson." James's face lit up immediately. "Margaret, of course I remember you. You were the first person to help me understand that what happened that day was something good, rather than something to be ashamed of." "I've been following your story," Margaret said, her eyes twinkling with pride. "The foundation you've started, the changes you've inspired in military training, it's Remarkable how one moment of choosing compassion over convention has rippled outward to touch so many lives. James looked around at the tourists who were now approaching, him with smiles rather than trepidation, at the young mother who was taking photos of her son laughing with a royal guard, at the crowd of people who seemed to understand that tradition and humanity could coexist beautifully. "I think about that day often," James said quietly. "I thought I was just helping a scared little girl, but really she was helping me. Emma taught me that grief doesn't have to make us hard or distant. It can actually make us more capable of recognizing when others need comfort." As his shift came to an end, James reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that hot summer day, when cold water had shocked him out of his emotional numbness. He had received a commendation from the palace, been promoted within the guard, and found a sense of purpose that went far beyond ceremonial duty. Most importantly, he had learned to honor David's memory not by shutting down his emotions, but by opening his heart to the people around him who needed help, comfort, or simply recognition of their humanity. The rigid protocols that had once felt like protection now felt like tools that could be used flexibly in service of something greater. That evening, James sat down to write his weekly letter to Emma, who was now 9 years old and had announced her intention to become either a teacher or a soldier when she grew up. "So I can help people like you do." James. As he began to write, James smiled, knowing that his brother David would be proud of the man he had become and the legacy of kindness that had grown from one small moment of choosing love over fear.